Richard Rawlings spent over a decade selling America a version of itself it wanted to believe in. The grease-stained hands, the cold beer, the screaming V8 engines coming back to life in a Dallas garage that felt like the last honest place on television. Fast and Loud wasn't just a show. It was a mythology, and Rawlings was its prophet. Millions of people who loved classic cars and muscle cars, and the idea that a guy with hustle could still find buried treasure in forgotten barns, built their weekends around watching him prove it. What federal investigators found when they finally opened the locked room inside Gas Monkey Garage wasn't a workspace. It was a machine that had been manufacturing that mythology from the beginning, printing history that never happened, stamping identities onto cars that never earned them, and selling the whole operation to the world as authenticity. The charges now surrounding Rawlings describe 15 years in federal prison with no chance of parole for a decade, and when that sentence landed in the Dallas courtroom, the man who once drove cross-country speed record runs for sport collapsed face first onto the defendant's table. Medics rushed in, oxygen masks went on, and 7 full minutes passed before order returned to that room. Discovery Channel pulled every episode of Fast and Loud from every streaming platform within 72 hours of the guilty verdict. Merchandise disappeared from shelves. Contracts dissolved. Networks don't move that fast unless they're genuinely frightened, and the entire automotive television world had very good reasons to be frightened because the fraud didn't originate with cars. It started with a $47,000 restaurant receipt filed under Automotive Parts and Supplies. IRS agents opened what they believed would be a routine quarterly audit of Gas Monkey Garage in late 2023, expecting minor discrepancies. What forensic accountants found instead was a financial architecture built to absorb criminal proceeds across multiple layers. Private jet flights appeared in the books as vehicle transport costs. Luxury vacations became research trips. Personal vehicles that Rawlings drove himself were listed as sale inventory that never actually sold, generating deductions on cars that never changed hands. Money flowed outward through offshore accounts and shell companies carrying names like Heritage Automotive Consulting and Classic Car Authentication Services, neither of which provided any legitimate service to anyone. They existed to move money and nothing else. The smoking gun was a VIN number, Vehicle Identification Number 7. RO2S125436, supposedly belonging to a 1967 Shelby GT500, one of the most valuable muscle cars ever produced, came back completely empty when investigators ran it through Ford's historical production records. That number had been attached to a car Rawlings sold for $1.2 million to Hans Müller, a wealthy German automotive enthusiast who had followed Gas Monkey Garage for years. Müller was exactly the kind of buyer Rawlings pursued, deeply passionate about American muscle cars, financially capable, and trusting enough to accept the Gas Monkey name as its own form of authentication. When Müller contacted European insurers, those companies verified everything. The VIN check failed immediately. Ford historians flagged the build sheet, and when experts examined the car physically, they confirmed it was a standard 1967 Mustang that had been professionally modified to impersonate a GT500, down to every visible detail. Federal prosecutors played the recorded phone calls between Müller and Rawlings in open court, and what they captured was a man trying to hold a lie together with both hands. Rawlings on tape, voice tightening under pressure, telling Müller the car was 100% authentic and that he had staked his entire reputation on vehicles like it. His reputation, it turned out, was exactly what he had staked and lost. The FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the Justice Department Fraud Unit assembled a joint task force within hours of Mueller's complaint reaching federal authorities, and what began as one ghost VIN number became a thread that pulled 8 years of systematic deception apart at every seam. Inside Gas Monkey Garage, behind a door listed on building plans as storage, employees had whispered for years about a room they called the Cage. Jake Morrison worked in the shop from 2018 to 2021 and testified under oath about industrial sounds coming from behind that locked door at all hours, printers running for hours on end, Rawlings disappearing inside alone and staying there. What investigators found when they opened it matched Morrison's account precisely. Industrial-grade VIN stamping equipment capable of replicating any manufacturer's numbering system, computer workstations carrying documentation templates for every major American automaker going back to the 1960s, and a master key that only Rawlings possessed. The room was an automotive identity theft center, and he had been operating it personally for nearly a decade. 3 former employees testified about what happened inside. Legitimate VIN plates were being stripped from scrapped vehicles and transplanted onto restored cars to create false provenance from scratch. Rawlings had built relationships with corrupt officials at state DMVs who would register vehicles carrying questionable paperwork in exchange for direct payment. A single fraudulent vehicle could generate revenue from multiple directions simultaneously. The initial sale, insurance claims filed on the car, loan collateral using it as security, and charitable donations of fabricated automobiles to museums that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax deductions for vehicles that had never existed in the form being donated. Robert Chen, a retired Ford assembly line worker who had been building Mustangs since 1965, caught something in a Season 4 Fast and Loud episode that professional investigators had overlooked. A supposed 1969 Boss 429 Mustang featured on the show carried an engine bay casting mark that Ford didn't use until 1971. Chen spent months documenting every technical inconsistency he found across multiple episodes. Wrong date codes on engine blocks, suspension components that didn't exist during the model years being claimed, paint codes no factory had offered during those production runs. His findings filled 47 pages and became the framework federal agents used to determine which gas monkey vehicles deserved forensic examination. Dr. Sarah Martinez, an automotive historian at the University of Michigan, added her analysis of factory documentation, identifying build sheets attached to multiple vehicles that showed paper with no signs of genuine decades-old storage, ink that hadn't faded the way authentic period documents fade, and formatting that didn't match manufacturer standards from the years being cited. The insurance fraud layer was where the charges escalated from fraud to racketeering. At least 17 vehicles cycled through a staged theft and destruction scheme over 6 years, generating more than $8.3 million in insurance payouts across that period. Each vehicle would be built with fraudulent documentation, sold to a shell company Rawlings controlled, insured at maximum valuation, and then reported stolen or destroyed. Insurance companies, trusting the Gas Monkey brand's established reputation, approved claims without deep investigation. The 1970 Plymouth Cuda, supposedly found in a rural Oklahoma barn and connected to racing legend Richard Petty, sold for $750,000 to Heritage Muscle Cars LLC, a Rawlings-controlled entity, then generated a $1.2 million payout 3 months after being reported stolen. That car was never stolen? It sat in a warehouse owned by another Rawlings shell company, being prepared for resale overseas under a completely different identity. Michael Torres, an insurance adjuster arrested on separate charges who immediately offered cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing, described the payment structure in detail. Adjusters received $10,000 to $25,000 per fraudulent claim approval. Storage facility operators collected $5,000 per staged theft. In at least 3 confirmed cases, local police officers filed false theft reports without conducting any actual investigation. Bank records showed regular payments from Gas Monkey accounts disguised as consulting fees, with timing that aligned directly with fraudulent claims. Barrett Jackson discovered that at least 23 vehicles with questionable Gas Monkey provenance had passed through their auctions between 2015 and 2023, generating over $18 million in sales. A 1969 Dodge Charger R/T that sold for $2.3 million in 2019 carried a VIN plate that had been welded onto a completely different vehicle, while the car that legitimately held that identity had been destroyed in a junkyard in 1987. Meckham Auctions found 31 Gas Monkey-connected vehicles in their own records. Hagerty Insurance froze all related claims and launched what they described as the largest authentication review in automotive insurance history, covering more than 200 existing policies. Classic muscle car prices dropped an average of 15% within 6 months of the scandal becoming public. Maria Santos, a former bookkeeper for one of Rawlings' shell companies, testified about a network she called the International Pipeline pipeline designed to move fraudulent vehicles overseas before documentation could be challenged domestically. Payments ranging from $50,000 to $100,000 went to officials at the Port of Long Beach, the Port of Miami, and the Port of Houston, ensuring specific shipments bypassed thorough customs inspection. Federal prosecutors expanded the case to include international smuggling and customs fraud charges, coordinating with Interpol and customs agencies across 15 countries. The investigation now involves more than 200 federal agents and prosecutors. Evidence seized from a storage facility in Nevada, described by investigators as the graveyard, included dozens of partially destroyed vehicles being prepared for disposal, with components from cars reported stolen years earlier found in the wreckage. Dennis Collins, once Rawlings' closest business partner, became the prosecution's key witness and described a pattern of incremental entrapment where small deceptions were introduced first and escalated gradually until associates were too deeply involved to walk away without destroying themselves. Rawlings sits in federal prison today, placed in protective custody after receiving threats from people who lost money in gas monkey-connected ventures, spending 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Federal investigators estimate at least 12 historically significant vehicles were crushed under what insiders called the disposal protocol, automobiles reduced to scrap metal to eliminate evidence, gone permanently from automotive history.